If you were Pope Leo X in the early 16th century, you had an expensive problem. You were commissioning the construction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, a project so massive it would take 120 years, and the work of Michelangelo, Raphael, and Bernini to finish. Projects on this scale required massive revenues. This is an indulgence. It's an official document stamped with papal authority, guaranteeing the buyer a reduction of punishment for their sins in the afterlife. To fund the construction of St. Peter's, the church aggressively scaled up the sale of these receipts. For a high enough price, you could even purchase one for a deceased relative to reduce their time in purgatory. Catholic doctrine already had a complex internal logic regarding penance, but on the ground, traveling salesmen like the Dominican friar Johann Tetzel were operating under commission arrangements. They were given assigned territories and sales quotas. To maximize revenue, Tetzel used memorized pitches, telling crowds that as soon as their coin hit the coffer, a soul from purgatory would spring toward heaven. This local sales tactic caught the attention of an obscure professor of theology named Martin Luther. He was a loyal monk, but as a priest in Wittenberg, he was encountering parishioners who presented these documents as a substitute for actual confession. They told Luther they didn't need to change their behavior because they had already paid for their forgiveness. The most powerful religious institution in Western history was behaving like a financially overextended corporation. It had an enormous building project in Rome, and to service that debt, it was prioritizing immediate revenue over its own theological rules. It had created a vulnerability that its leadership didn't even recognize yet. This is the disputation on the power and efficacy of indulgences, the 95 Theses. In 1517, Luther wrote these 95 propositions challenging salesmen like Tetzel. Written in Latin, it was unreadable to the public, a formal academic request, not a populist call to action. He mailed copies to his local bishops, asking them to examine the claims of the indulgence sellers. He was an employee writing a memo to his superiors to fix a clerical error, fully expecting the Pope to agree that the sales tactics had gone too far. For an internal academic dispute to reach a mass audience, it needed a catalyst that Luther never saw coming. Johannes Gutenberg had invented the mechanical printing press 60 years earlier. By 1517, it was widely deployed across Europe, functioning as a multiplier of information that the Church could not control. It allowed for the reproduction of text at a volume that was impossible in the era of handwritten manuscripts. Unknown third parties took Luther's Latin text and translated it into German. This shift in language turned a specialist debate into a focal point for public outrage. Within weeks, the 95 Theses were circulating across Germany, feeding a population that was already deeply resentful of money flowing from German territories to Rome. The document spread across Europe faster than censorship could track. Thousands of copies were already being read in Switzerland, Scandinavia, and England. Authorities tried burning physical papers, but were overwhelmed by the sheer volume. The traditional mechanisms for suppressing heresy were failing. The technology stripped Luther of his control over the conversation. His private questions were now weaponized public slogans he could no longer recall. In Rome, Pope Leo X miscalculated. Because of the geographic distance from Germany, he dismissed the controversy as a minor squabble among monks that would resolve itself. As Luther's questions began to challenge the nature of salvation and papal authority itself, the Church's response hardened. In 1520, the Pope issued this official decree, a papal bull. It gave Luther 60 days to recant or face excommunication. Luther responded by publicly burning the bull in Wittenberg. When summoned before the Holy Roman Emperor at the Diet of Worms, he refused to take back his writings unless convinced by scripture or reason. The Church's hostility had pushed him from a reformer into an open rebel. Then the movement hit a second catalyst, German politics. Powerful princes hid and protected Luther, seeing his challenge as a convenient excuse to stop paying taxes to Rome and assert political independence. What began as a monk's letter had mutated into a geopolitical tool used by opportunists to lock in a permanent fracture. Luther lived to see the violent consequences of the movement he had sparked. Peasant revolts swept across Europe, with radicals using his theological arguments as a justification for armed slaughter. He was horrified by the chaos. He also watched the movement splinter into dozens of competing, contradictory groups, Calvinists, Anabaptists, and others.
Luther found these new Protestant factions to be just as erroneous as the Catholic doctrine he had left behind. The reformer spent his final years trapped between two worlds, fighting the Catholic dogma he had abandoned and the radical doctrines he had unintentionally birthed. The toll of this religious fracture was massive. It triggered a century of warfare, culminating in the 30 Years' War, which killed roughly a third of the population of Central Europe. The long-term consequences shaped the modern secular world. The treaties that ended these wars established the principle of state sovereignty, while the shift in theology contributed to the development of modern capitalism. Western Christianity has never recovered its unity. The split that Luther precipitated has lasted 500 years, ending a 1,000-year institutional monopoly. History is rarely shaped by masterminds with sweeping plans. It is shaped by individuals taking limited actions that collide with massive historical pressures. St. Peter's Basilica still stands today, a monument of human architecture and the physical trigger for a religious fracture that hasn't healed in 5 centuries.